Relay connection established. Archive access granted. Origin unknown. Verification impossible. Proceeding with recovered transmission. Designation, Ninth Relay.
My name is Jeff. I'm 44 years old, and until the night I found Frost Hollow Church, I didn't think of myself as lonely. I worked from home as an insurance adjuster, which meant most of my life happened inside the same few rooms. I woke up, made coffee, sat down in the spare bedroom I called my office, reviewed photos of damaged roofs and flooded basements, answered emails, took calls, wrote reports, and logged off when the day was done. Then I made dinner, watched television, took my dog outside, and went to bed. It wasn't a bad life. That's what I told myself anyway. Quiet is easy to mistake for peace when you've lived with it long enough. The only living thing that seemed truly happy to see me every day was Scout. He was my 12-year-old black lab, old enough that his face had gone gray, and his back legs didn't always cooperate on cold mornings. Every day at 5, he would shuffle into my office and put his chin on my knee, as if he'd been waiting all day for me to become a real person again. I loved that dog more than I probably knew how to admit. Looking back, I think he was the only thing keeping my life from becoming completely silent. Every now and then, my company needed someone to inspect a property in person, and I usually volunteered. Most people didn't want to drive across North Dakota in December, but I liked the excuse to leave the house. That was why I was near Leeds the day the storm came in. The inspection itself was simple. A machine shed had taken wind damage, and I spent the morning photographing bent panels and broken supports before heading home in the early afternoon. The forecast said light snow after sunset, so I stopped at a diner for coffee before getting back on the road. The waitress looked out the window while refilling my cup and said, "You heading west?" When I told her I was, she frowned and said I might want to wait until morning. An older farmer 2 stools down added, "Stay on the highway if you go. Don't take the county roads today." I thanked them both and left anyway, because people who live alone get used to making decisions without anyone else weighing in. About an hour later, my radio turned to static, my GPS lost signal, and the road disappeared beneath the blowing snow so thick it looked like the world had been erased. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel while the truck rocked under the wind. For several miles, I saw nothing but white. Then a row of warm yellow lights appeared through the storm off to my right. At first, I thought it was a house. As I got closer, the shape came into view. A small white church standing alone on the prairie, with stained glass windows glowing against the snow and smoke rising from the chimney. It looked impossible out there, but it also looked warm, and at that moment, warm was enough. I pulled into the lot, shut off the truck, and hurried up the steps. The moment my boots touched the porch, the church bell rang once. I assumed someone had seen me coming. When I opened the door, heat and the smell of coffee, wood smoke, and fresh bread washed over me. An elderly pastor stood near the front of the sanctuary, and the pews were filled with people dressed for Sunday service, even though it was Thursday evening. The pastor looked up, smiled like I was exactly who he'd been waiting for, and said, "Come in, Jeff. You're letting the cold in." I stopped with one hand still on the door. I hadn't told anyone my name. For a second, I wondered if I had misheard him, thinking perhaps he had said friend, or son, or something else that had been swallowed by the wind. Before I could ask, an older woman appeared beside me carrying a folded blanket. With a warm smile, she told me I looked frozen and urged me away from the door before I caught my death. She draped the blanket over my shoulders before I could protest and gently took my coat from my hands, assuring me they would get it dried out. I thanked her, still trying to figure out how the pastor knew my name. My first thought was that maybe my truck had some kind of company logo with my name on it, but I dismissed the idea almost immediately. Even if it did, There was no way anyone could have read it through the snow. The pastor finished his closing prayer, and the congregation slowly began filing toward the back of the church. Several people stopped to shake my hand as they passed, introducing themselves and greeting me as if they already knew me. Not one of them asked who I was, and not one of them seemed surprised that a stranger had walked through their doors in the middle of a blizzard. Instead, they welcomed me with the easy familiarity of people greeting an old neighbor who had been away for a while. Eventually, I gave up trying to understand it. It was hard to be suspicious of people who insisted on making sure your coffee cup stayed full. The fellowship hall downstairs looked exactly like every small-town church basement I had ever visited growing up. Folding tables stretched across the room, beneath warm lights, covered with steaming casseroles, homemade bread, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and enough desserts to feed twice as many people as were there. Someone pressed a mug of coffee into my hands before I even reached the end of the stairs, and an older gentleman told me to sit wherever I liked, assuring me there was always room for one more. I found an empty chair near the middle of one table, but before I could sit down, a little girl with blonde hair and 2 braids hurried over carrying a deck of playing cards and announced that I could sit by her. Her mother sighed apologetically, but the girl insisted I look nice. I laughed and thanked her for the vote of confidence, and she beamed with certainty. That made me smile. Dinner started almost immediately, with bowls and plates passed around the table, while conversations drifted from Christmas preparations to snowfall totals, and whose driveway would probably need digging out first. Nobody seemed interested in talking about themselves for very long. They were far more interested in hearing about everyone else. When someone asked what I did for a living, I explained that I worked from home handling insurance claims, which prompted a joking accusation that I was one of the people who told them their roofs were not as damaged as they thought. The entire table laughed, and I admitted that sometimes it was true. The man pointed his fork at me with exaggerated disappointment, before grinning and declaring he still liked me, which made me laugh harder than the joke probably deserved. Halfway through the meal, I realized something strange. I was not checking the time. Normally, whenever I was around people I did not know very well, part of my mind was always wondering when it would be polite to leave. But here, that thought never came. Conversation moved so naturally from one person to the next that I found myself simply listening, something I had not done in a long time. After dinner, people began clearing dishes, while others gathered around a stone fireplace in one corner of the room, and someone dealt cards onto one of the tables. The little girl, Emily, looked at me expectantly and insisted I had said I would play. I did not remember saying that, but when I asked her mother if she always won arguments like this, she admitted it happened more often than she would like, so I sat down. The card game itself was nothing special, loud and slightly chaotic, filled with good-natured accusations that Emily was making up the rules as she went. Every time someone caught her bending them in her favor, she would giggle and promise not to do it again, before immediately trying something different. Watching everyone laugh around that table, I realized I could not remember the last time I had spent an evening with people who were not in a hurry. Nobody glanced at a phone, nobody talked about getting back to work, and nobody seemed distracted. They were simply there, present, and it felt oddly refreshing. That was when I noticed Clara. She was not trying to draw attention to herself. While everyone else laughed over the card game, she quietly collected empty coffee mugs from another table and carried them toward the kitchen. As she passed, Emily called out that I needed more coffee, which I protested, but Clara smiled and said she would let me decide that. She returned a minute later with a fresh mug anyway, explaining that I looked like I was thinking too hard. I laughed and asked if it was that obvious, and she replied that it was only to someone paying attention. She sat down across from me, wrapped both hands around her own mug, and smiled before asking me to tell her something about myself. that had nothing to do with work. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. And to my surprise, I realized I could not remember the last time anyone had asked me that question. I must have sat there in silence longer than I realized, because Clara smiled sympathetically, instead of looking uncomfortable. She told me it was a harder question than people think, and I admitted that it probably was. After taking a sip of her coffee, she asked what I had enjoyed doing before work started taking up so much of my life. The question caught me off guard, mostly because I had never really thought about it that way. Work hadn't stolen my hobbies overnight. They had simply disappeared one at a time until I stopped noticing they were gone. I told her that I used to fish, explaining that my dad and I went almost every weekend when I was growing up. She nodded, waiting for me to continue, so I added that I had also played guitar. Nothing special, just enough to stumble through a few songs around a campfire. When she asked what had happened, I shrugged and said that life had gotten in the way. She smiled gently and said she didn't think that was really an answer. I laughed and told her it was the only one I had. For a moment, she simply looked at me without judging or trying to correct me. It was the kind of silence that invited honesty instead of demanding it. After a while, I admitted that I had just gotten busy, and one day I looked around and realized I hadn't picked up my guitar in years. Fishing had become something I always planned to do next weekend, and eventually, there were enough next weekends that I stopped pretending. She nodded as though I had told her something important, and asked if I missed it. I started to say no, but instead I surprised myself by admitting quietly that I did. She smiled, not because she had been proven right, but because I had finally answered honestly, and she said she hoped I would find my way back to it. There wasn't anything particularly profound about what she said, but it landed harder than I expected. The conversation drifted naturally after that. She asked about Scout, and I told her how I had adopted him from a shelter nearly 10 years earlier, after promising myself I wouldn't get attached to another dog. I lasted about 15 minutes before he climbed into my lap and made the decision for me. Laughing, I said I should have known then, and when she asked what I meant, I explained that he hadn't been asking for permission. She laughed and said she had heard labs have a way of choosing their people, and I agreed that he had definitely chosen me. When she asked what Scout would say if he could talk, I smiled at the image and said he would probably insist that dinner should be 2 hours earlier. She said she had been hoping for something more profound, but I told her Scout wasn't complicated. She tilted her head thoughtfully and said she thought dogs usually understand people better than we understand ourselves. It was such an ordinary observation, but it lingered in my mind. Someone called Clara's name from the kitchen, and she excused herself to help clean up. As she walked away, I found myself watching her for a moment before catching myself. It wasn't that I was attracted to her, although she was certainly beautiful. It was something else. She had spent the last half hour asking questions no one had asked me in years, not because she was making conversation, but because she genuinely seemed interested in the answers. I couldn't remember the last time I had talked about myself without feeling like I was wasting someone's time. Emily suddenly appeared beside me, holding the deck of cards against her chest, and announced that I liked Clara. I nearly choked on the coffee I had just taken and asked what she meant. She grinned mischievously and said I smiled differently. I told her I didn't know what that meant, but she insisted that she did. I laughed and shook my head, telling her she was too smart for her own good, and she replied that she heard that a lot. She climbed into the chair beside me and leaned closer, saying that Clara liked talking to me too. When I asked what made her think that, Emily looked genuinely confused and said it was because Clara was still smiling. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw Clara laughing with Mrs. Henderson while drying dishes. Emily was right. She was smiling. For reasons I couldn't explain, that simple realization made me smile too. It had been a very long time since someone I had just met had made me feel like they were genuinely happy I was there, and the thought settled over me quietly, refusing to leave once it did. The rest of the evening passed so naturally that I lost track of time entirely. Someone added another log to the fire, while a few of the older men argued good-naturedly about whether the local high school football team had ever truly been as good as everyone remembered. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside me every 20 minutes with another cup of coffee or another slice of pie, despite my repeated insistence that I couldn't possibly eat any more. Emily eventually abandoned the card game to show me every Christmas decoration in the building, proudly explaining which ornaments she had helped make over the years. I listened as though each one carried great historical importance, because to her, they clearly did. It struck me that nobody in Frost Hollow ever seemed to speak just to fill silence. When someone asked a question, they genuinely wanted the answer. And when someone told a story, everyone else listened. There were no phones on the tables, no televisions humming in the background, and no one constantly checking the time. I hadn't realized how unusual that had become until I found myself wishing I could bottle the feeling and take it home with me. At some point, I wandered back upstairs into the sanctuary. The lights had been dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the stained glass windows and a few lamps near the altar. Snow drifted lazily past the windows, and for the first time all evening, I remembered there was still a blizzard outside. Clara's voice broke the quiet as she stepped up behind me and remarked that it was beautiful at night. I agreed, and she came to stand beside me, gazing toward the front of the church. She told me she had always liked the room after everyone went downstairs because it felt peaceful, and I admitted I had been thinking the same thing. We stood together in a comfortable silence, neither of us feeling the need to speak. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when simply being in someone else's presence is enough. Eventually, I asked if I could ask her something, and when she said yes, I wondered aloud if the place had always been like this. She smiled and asked what I meant, and I struggled to explain, finally admitting that everyone there just seemed happy. She considered that for a moment, before saying she thought everyone wanted the same things: to be welcomed when they arrived and missed when they left. Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. I couldn't remember the last time I had been anywhere that I would actually be missed if I walked out the door. She looked at me and smiled, as though she had guessed what I was thinking, and told me she was glad I had found them that night. There was no flirtation or hidden meaning in her words. She was simply happy I had come through the door. I found myself smiling back and telling her I was glad I had found her too. The words slipped out before I could think about them, but she didn't blush or seem embarrassed. Instead, she nodded as though she had expected that answer all along, and said she had been hoping I would feel that way. Before I could ask what she meant, the pastor appeared at the entrance to the sanctuary and explained that the roads still weren't safe. He told me they had prepared one of the guest rooms upstairs if I wanted to spend the night, assuring me there was no pressure, only a desire to know I would be warm, rather than out fighting the storm. I looked out through one of the windows and saw that the wind had picked up again, driving curtains of snow across the parking lot. My truck was barely visible beneath a thick blanket of white. For reasons that had nothing to do with the weather, staying suddenly felt like exactly what I wanted to do. I accepted the pastor's offer without much hesitation. Under any other circumstances, spending the night in a church with people I had only met a few hours earlier would have seemed strange, but instead it felt oddly natural. Mrs. Henderson insisted on showing me to one of the guest rooms herself, apologizing several times that it wasn't anything fancy, though she needn't have bothered. The room was spotless, with a neatly made bed, a quilt folded across the foot, and an old wooden dresser beneath a window overlooking the snow-covered prairie. It reminded me of staying at my grandparents' house when I was a kid. She paused at the doorway and told me not to hesitate if I needed anything, and I thanked her for everything they had done. She smiled warmly and said they were just glad I was there. After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the muffled laughter drifting up through the floorboards as the last few people finished cleaning downstairs. I couldn't make out any words, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't alone, and I realized how much I had missed that feeling. My house was always quiet, and I had convinced myself I preferred it that way. But sitting there in the old church made me wonder if I had simply forgotten what a home full of people sounded like. Eventually, I stretched out on the bed and stared at the ceiling, my thoughts drifting back to Clara, not because I was imagining some whirlwind romance, but because of our conversation. She had asked me questions no one had asked in years, not about my job or what I did for a living, but about who I had been before life settled into the routine I had accepted, without question. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped talking about those things, assuming no one really cared, but she had. I found myself wondering what she had been like growing up, whether she had always lived in Frost Hollow, whether she liked to read, or if she had hobbies she had slowly let slip away too. Then it struck me that I had spent most of the evening talking about myself, and I knew almost nothing about her. Oddly enough, that didn't bother me. It simply gave me another reason to hope I would see her again in the morning. By then, the room had grown completely quiet. I switched off the bedside lamp and lay there listening to the wind against the windows. And that was when I thought about Scout. I pictured him lying on the living room rug, ears perked toward the front door every time a car passed, waiting up for me, as he always did, when I worked late, refusing to settle until he heard my keys in the lock. A knot formed in my stomach. My neighbor had a spare key for emergencies, but I hadn't called anyone before the storm, and as far as Scout knew, I had simply disappeared. I glanced toward the window, where the snow was still falling, though not as heavily as before, and for the first time all evening, I considered leaving as soon as the roads opened. The thought surprised me, not because I wanted to leave, but because I didn't. I wanted one more breakfast with these people, one more cup of coffee, one more card game with Emily, and one more conversation with Clara. I smiled to myself in the darkness, realizing that it had taken less than a day for complete strangers to make me feel more at home than I had in years, and I couldn't decide whether that was something wonderful or a little sad. I slept better that night than I had in months. When I woke the next morning, pale winter sunlight filtered through the curtains, and for a few seconds I had no idea where I was. Then laughter drifted up from somewhere downstairs, followed by the unmistakable smell of fresh cinnamon rolls, and I remembered. Emily hadn't been exaggerating. By the time I made my way to the fellowship hall, breakfast was already underway. Mrs. Henderson spotted me before I reached the last step and teased that she had been about to send Emily up to wake me. Emily looked up from the table and declared she would have done it, earning a proud grin when Mrs. Henderson agreed. Before I had even taken my seat, a plate appeared in front of me, eggs, bacon, cinnamon rolls, and a mug of coffee that seemed to refill itself whenever I wasn't looking. The room carried the same easy warmth as the night before, filled with overlapping conversations, laughter, and playful arguments about who would wash dishes afterward. I found myself wondering how long it had been since I'd sat at a table where everyone genuinely wanted to be there. Clara eventually slipped into the empty chair beside me and asked if I had slept well. I told her it was better than I had in a long time, and she smiled, pleased. As she buttered a cinnamon roll, I watched the snow falling beyond the basement windows and admitted that I would probably have to head home once the roads were clear. She simply nodded and agreed that I probably should. There was no disappointment in her voice, no attempt to persuade me to stay, just quiet acceptance. Strangely, that made leaving feel even harder, After breakfast, people began cleaning up, but every time I offered to help, I was gently turned away and told to enjoy the morning. So I wandered outside onto the front steps. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie stretched out for miles beneath untouched snow that sparkled under a bright blue sky. My truck sat where I had left it, nearly buried to the wheel wells, but otherwise unharmed. I stood there for several minutes, breathing in the cold air. Behind me, the church door opened, and Clara stepped onto the porch carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to me, saying she thought I might want one more. I smiled and joked that she was starting to read my mind, but she laughed softly and said she simply paid attention. As she looked out across the empty prairie, she remarked that most people spent too much time waiting for their turn to talk. I admitted I had probably been guilty of that, but she shook her head and said she thought I had spent a long time believing nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. Looking down into my coffee, I realized she wasn't wrong. I wasn't even sure when that belief had taken hold. She said it often happened so slowly that you didn't notice until someone finally listened. We stood together in silence after that, not because we had nothing left to say, but because neither of us felt the need to fill the quiet. Eventually I sighed and said I should probably get going. She smiled and said she knew. For reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to ask if I could come back someday. But instead, I asked if I would ever find this place again. She looked at the church, then back at me, and said that if I was meant to, I would. It didn't sound mysterious, more like hope than certainty. Before I could respond, Emily burst through the front doors and ran straight toward me, wrapping her arms around my waist. She told me I would come back, and I laughed, saying I would try. She stepped back and looked at me with complete confidence, insisting that she knew I would. Then she reached into the pocket of my coat, tucked something inside, and skipped back toward the church before I could ask what she was doing. When I checked my pocket, there was nothing there. I smiled to myself, assuming she had only been pretending, though it wouldn't be the last time I thought about that moment. As I finished my coffee, the rest of the congregation gradually made their way outside. Mrs. Henderson hugged me before I could object, telling me that next time I visited, she expected me to arrive hungry. Harold shook my hand with both of his and reminded me that the fishing was good once the ice melted. Even the pastor seemed reluctant to let me leave, though there was no sadness in his expression, only a gentle smile. He told me it had been a blessing having me there, and I replied that the blessing had been mine. He rested a hand on my shoulder and said their door was always open, a common expression that I barely thought about at the time. I climbed into my truck and let the engine warm while everyone stood together on the church steps. Emily waved with both hands. Mrs. Henderson tucked her arms inside her apron to keep warm, and Harold tipped his cap. The pastor stood quietly beside them, and Clara raised one hand in a small wave, smiling the same gentle smile she had worn since we met. I waved back, and for reasons I still can't explain, driving away felt harder than ending relationships that had lasted years. I kept looking in the rearview mirror until the church disappeared behind a rise in the road. The drive home was uneventful. Snowplows had already cleared the highways, and by early afternoon I pulled into my driveway. Before I could even unlock the front door, I heard Scout barking from inside the house. The moment I stepped through the door, he barreled into me with more energy than I had seen from him in months. His tail slapped against the wall as he whined and leaned his full weight against my legs, as if he needed to make sure I was really home. I knelt beside him, rubbing behind his ears and telling him I knew. He licked my face, then trotted toward the kitchen, stopping every few feet to make sure I was following. Laughing, I told him I was coming. After feeding him and giving him his morning medication hidden inside a piece of cheese, I started a fresh pot of coffee. Scout settled onto the rug in the living room, with a satisfied sigh while I carried my mug to the computer. I couldn't stop thinking about Frost Hollow, not because I was frightened, but because I wanted to go back. I wanted to thank everyone properly, to bring Mrs. Henderson something for all the meals she had insisted I eat, and to have another card game with Emily. And if I was being completely honest with myself, I wanted another conversation with Clara. I realized then that I had spent nearly an entire evening talking to her, yet I knew almost nothing about her life. She had spent most of our conversations asking about mine, somehow making me feel like the most interesting person in the room without ever making herself the center of attention. Smiling, I opened my browser and considered that maybe I would drive back the following weekend. Maybe call ahead if they had a phone, maybe even bring Scout. I typed 2 words into the search bar, Frost Hollow. The first few results weren't helpful, an old township map, a genealogy website, but then I noticed an article from the North Dakota Historical Society titled Frost Hollow Township, Abandoned 1939. Curious, I clicked it, and within a minute, the smile had disappeared from my face. The article wasn't very long, but it painted a vivid picture of Frost Hollow as a small farming community that had never grown beyond a handful of families. At its peak, fewer than 60 people had lived there. It had a general store, a one-room schoolhouse, and a small church that served as the heart of the town. The writer described neighbors helping one another through harsh winters, gathering for Sunday dinners, and celebrating every holiday together. I found myself smiling despite everything, because it sounded exactly like the place I had just left. Then I reached the next paragraph, and the smile faded. On December 18th, 1938, an unexpected blizzard had trapped members of the Frost Hollow Community Church following Sunday service. Rescue crews reached the church 3 days later, but none of the 32 members of the congregation had survived. The loss devastated the settlement, and within a year, Frost Hollow had been abandoned. I read the paragraph again, then a third time, my coffee sitting untouched beside the keyboard, as I stared at the screen. No, I whispered into the empty room. There had to be another church, another Frost Hollow, some explanation that made sense. But instead, my eyes drifted farther down the page, to a black and white photograph. The congregation stood on the front steps of the church, bundled in heavy winter coats, smiling into the camera. I recognized the pastor immediately. Even in an 80-year-old photograph, there was no mistaking him. Beside him stood Mrs. Henderson, Harold, and the older couple who had insisted I take another slice of pie. Then my eyes found Emily, wearing the same oversized winter coat, the same braids, the same mischievous smile. My stomach tightened as I slowly, almost afraid to look, searched the photograph one face at a time. Near the edge of the front row stood Clara. She looked exactly as she had less than 24 hours earlier, with the same eyes, the same smile, and the same braid resting over one shoulder. I leaned closer to the monitor, searching for anything that would convince me I was mistaken. A different face, a different expression, a different woman who only happened to resemble her. But there wasn't one. I pushed my chair back from the desk, and Scout lifted his head from the rug to watch me. "This isn't possible," I muttered, but he only thumped his tail against the floor. My hands had started to shake. I closed the Historical Society page and searched again. This time, not for the town, but for the church. Instead, another result caught my attention. Unsolved winter disappearances near Frost Hollow. Curiosity outweighed reason, and I clicked it. The page listed several missing persons cases spanning decades, and most had one thing in common. Every disappearance had happened during or immediately after a snowstorm, within a few miles of Frost Hollow. The first case was from 1974, a rancher driving home after checking his cattle. His truck had been found abandoned, but he never was. There was a photograph attached to the article, and I recognized him immediately. He had been sitting across from me during supper, the one who joked about insurance adjusters never believing roofs were actually damaged. I stared at the picture until the words beneath it blurred, then clicked the next article. A school teacher from 1988, missing after her car slid into a ditch. I recognized her too. She had poured me coffee at breakfast. Another article described a truck driver from 2007 who had laughed louder than anyone during Emily's card game. I stopped opening them after that because I didn't need to. I already knew what I was going to see. Every few years, someone disappeared near Frost Hollow, and somehow, they all found a seat at the same table. I slowly closed the laptop as Scout wandered over and rested his head against my knee. Without thinking, I scratched behind his ears, and for a long time, neither of us moved. The strange part wasn't that I was frightened. The strange part was that I still wanted to go back. I sat there for a long time with Scout asleep against my leg, staring at a blank computer screen after I'd closed the browser, trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the storm had disoriented me, or maybe I'd wandered into another town with another church that only happened to look the same. I even considered that the photograph might not have been as clear as I remembered. But one by one, every explanation fell apart. I could still smell the coffee, still hear Emily laughing every time she quietly changed the rules of the card game, and still picture Mrs. Henderson pretending to be offended when I refused another cinnamon roll. Most of all, I could still hear Clara asking me who I had been before work became my whole life. You don't remember dreams like that. Over the next few weeks, I tried to stop thinking about Frost Hollow by burying myself in work, but it didn't take long before I began making small changes. I pulled my old guitar out of the closet and spent an afternoon relearning chords I'd forgotten years earlier. A few weekends later, I drove to a nearby lake with an old fishing pole that had been gathering dust in my garage. I even started taking Scout on longer walks before work, instead of rushing through them. Clara had been right. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten the parts of myself that made life feel like more than a routine, and for that reminder, I'll always be grateful. But gratitude doesn't erase questions. Sometimes late at night, after Scout had fallen asleep beside my chair, I'd find myself opening the map on my computer and tracing the roads back toward where Frost Hollow should have been. I never made the drive. Part of me was afraid I wouldn't find anything, and another part of me was afraid I would. I've thought about that church almost every time it snowed since then, not because I think something evil lives there. Nothing about that place felt evil, but because of how it made me feel. The people I met welcomed me without asking for anything in return. They fed me, laughed with me, listened to me, and treated me like I'd always had a place at their table. They never asked me to stay. They simply made me wish I could. I still don't know what Frost Hollow really is. Maybe it only appears to people who need it, or maybe it appears to everyone, and most of us simply drive past without noticing. Maybe those people who disappeared over the years made the same choice I almost made. I honestly don't know. Scout is 13 now, his muzzle almost completely gray, and he doesn't run to the door the way he used to. Most evenings he simply shuffles over, rests his head on my knee, and lets out a tired sigh, while I scratch behind his ears. Every time he does, I think about the morning I left Frost Hollow. I left because someone was waiting for me. Someone needed me. If Scout hadn't been there, if there hadn't been a quiet little house for me to come home to, I don't know what I would have done. And that's the part that still unsettles me. It isn't that I might have disappeared, or even that I might have died. It's that for one evening, in the middle of a North Dakota blizzard, I found a place where I felt completely seen, where strangers became friends, where silence wasn't lonely, and where I didn't feel like an afterthought in my own life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed for one more breakfast, one more cup of coffee, one more conversation with Clara. I don't wonder whether I would have survived. I wonder whether, for the first time in a very long time, I would have finally felt like I was home. I don't know which answer scares me more.
Transmission complete. Archive updated. Relay connection terminated. Signal lost.